Good morning, aspiring authors. My name is Michael Hall, author of the upcoming novel How to Be Alone, and welcome to the channel. Today we're looking at this comment on my previous vlog, week 2, where user NT suggested a tips video about how to write a scene that you hate writing. And this is such a good suggestion. Thank you so much for suggesting it, NT. And if you have any more suggestions, anybody watching this, make sure you tell me down in the comments, and I will do my best to see if I can respond to any of them. But today, we're going to be going over the top 9 tips for writing a scene that you hate. Make sure you stick around to the end, especially for tip number 3, because that might save your entire novel. Without further ado, let's get on to the list. At tip number 9, we have don't ignore this feeling. It makes a lot of sense when newer authors reach a point in their novel where they don't want to keep writing because they hate what they're writing, and they assume that this is just part of the writing process because writing is hard, and everybody says writing is hard, and that is true. But if you're writing a scene and you hate it, that is your brain trying to tell you that something is wrong with it. So if you are currently writing a scene and you hate writing it, and you want to know how can I get through this, step 1, listen to that feeling, because it's telling you that you need to fix something. And then step 2 is diagnose what it is. So the next 8 tips in this list are going to be showing you different ways to diagnose exactly what might be going on with your scene. Because the easiest way to write a scene that you hate is to stop hating it. And the first tip for fixing a scene that you hate is tip number 8, which is to figure out what makes this scene important. Once you realize why you absolutely need to keep this scene, what information it's trying to convey to the readers, then you can change everything around that information so that it changes from a scene that you hate writing to a scene that you love. So this information that you're conveying to the readers, it could be one of many things. It could be world building exposition, it could be character development, it could be conflict development, whatever it is. Once you figure out why you can't remove this scene, what makes it so important, then you have to ask yourself these 2 questions. Does it need to happen exactly here? And does it need to happen exactly like this? If you decide it doesn't have to happen exactly here in the novel, then maybe it could come later or even sooner. If while you were writing, you realized that there was a certain bit of information that you needed to write for a specific scene that was about to come up, you might feel like you have to shoehorn it somehow into this scene, into this part of your story. But that probably isn't going to be the best place to put it, and it's not going to work the best for your book. And if you hate writing that scene and feel like you need to have this information in your story, that might be why you hate it, because this isn't where it needs to go. So consider other places in your story that you could put it. If it's not that, and you decide that it has to happen here, but maybe it doesn't have to happen in this exact way, then this could be one of the most rewarding ways to shake up your story. There have been many times where there was a scene that I had already planned in my head of how it was going to go. And when I got there, I decided to stick to the original plan, but as I was writing, it didn't feel right. And the truth is, that's because it wasn't. And that's probably because I hadn't written the book yet when I decided how I wanted the scene to happen. So I didn't know how the pacing would have felt up until that moment if at this exact time I really needed a lengthy dialogue sequence, or if instead it had to be a fight scene because there hadn't been a fight scene in over a chapter, right? So sometimes you have to go against the grain and change things up, and if you do that, the scene that you hate writing might end up becoming your favorite of the whole book. Coming in at number 7, and tip number 7 is you might have too much exposition. Maybe the important information, the reason that this scene absolutely needs to stay, is exposition, is telling the reader something that they weren't there for. And if a scene exists solely for the purpose of exposition dumping, then it probably shouldn't stay. What I mean by that is you need to have a more layered scene than just exposition. If you want your reader to be engaged with the world and the characters that you've built, you need to tell them about it in an engaging way. For example, don't tell the reader the cataclysmic event destroyed thousands of homes and the people of town were never the same. Instead, Show the reader the aftermath of the event. Have broken up dialogue from the townspeople where they talk about it. And have the protagonists reflect on it through their personal character voices. If you do that, it adds a personal touch to the history and events of your story, and it'll more deeply invest the reader not only in the exposition, but also in the characters that exist in the world, and the world itself. The thing is that, for this example, the cataclysm could have happened to anybody. It could have happened in any story. So you need to tell us why it had to happen here in this story to these characters. Remember, exposition dumps don't trust anybody. They don't trust the reader to be able to piece things together through context clues, and they don't trust the author to be able to convey information in interesting and creative ways. And just a little side note before we move on to tip 6. I know that this doesn't apply to all kinds of exposition, especially for high fantasy novels, where you need to talk a lot about the history of the world and politics and stuff. I don't personally have a lot of experience with that, so I can't really give tips on that. But for this specifically, this specific kind of exposition is something I just have more experience with. But if you have any tips for how to write big exposition like high fantasy politics and world building in a more interesting way, then make sure you tell us in the comments, because that could be helpful to anybody. You never know. Tip number 6, you're starting your novel too early. I have written countless first chapters, and so I've written countless opening pages, opening scenes, and I've started the novel tens of different ways, well, whatever novel it is. And the number one way to know if I need to start over and think of a new way to start my novel, it's if I hate writing it. And the thing about an opening scene is that of course it needs to happen. Of course you need to start the story. And so it's really easy to get into this mindset that, well, the beginning's boring, right? It has to be boring. I have to hate writing the opening, because that's not where the interesting things happen. But that's not true. Your opening should be just as interesting and just as fun to write and read as the rest of your story. And so if you hate writing it, it's probably because you're starting your story too early. What this means is that there was too much time between the first word of the novel and when the story began, when the conflict was introduced, when the inciting incident happened. For example, in my upcoming novel, How to Be Alone, the inciting incident is as early as the first page. But that was the most recent draft of the opening scene. I have written countless different variations to start just this one novel. One where 5 or 6 pages came before the inciting incident, and I hated it. I hated writing those opening sequences, but I convinced myself it needed to happen because I thought that all of the information that I was conveying had to happen at this time in this way. But the reality is, it didn't. And it was ultimately to the detriment of my story. And after I finished writing How to Be Alone, I started working on the sequel. And the same thing happened with that book. Where there were tons of different drafts where I would start it way too soon before the actual story began, and I hated writing it. And that was my brain telling me something's wrong and I need to fix it. And both times, I think the inciting incident ended up on one of the first few pages. Writing the inciting incident on the first few pages is not a hard and fast rule. That's what's worked the best for me in my most recent novels, but it depends entirely on the kind of story you're writing and the kind of context you need to give your readers before the story can start. The only thing that you should take from this tip is that if you're writing your opening scene and you hate writing it, it might be that you're starting your story too early, too soon before the inciting incident happens. But whether that takes 1 page, 5 pages, 20 pages, as long as it feels good to write, you should be fine. And it can always be ironed out in the editing phase if it still isn't perfect. But for now, it should be good enough if it just feels right to you. Tip number 5 is you might be experiencing the sagging middle syndrome. Sagging middle syndrome refers to a phenomenon where the middle parts of your story tend to be less engaging and often filled with more filler than the beginning and end of your story. This could be an entire video in its own right, but for the purpose of just this list, if you hate writing a scene takes place in the middle of your story, you might be feeling this sagging middle syndrome. Here are a few things that help just in general with a sagging middle. Introducing a midpoint twist. You can have a character betray your protagonist, or introduce new information that recontextualizes the story thus far. Or you can introduce any other kind of twist that'll keep both the reader and yourself engaged with the story that you're telling. Without a midpoint twist, it can start to feel like you're not giving your audience enough to chew on. Because, you know, the big twist at the beginning, maybe a big twist at the end, right? The twist at the beginning being the inciting incident, or when the characters they delve into the unknown. But the middle doesn't always get something that shakes the story up and makes it feel fresh again, like it did in the beginning. The second thing that you could do to shake up the sagging middle syndrome is to add character arc checkpoints. Introduce points in the middle of your novel that force the main characters to look inward at their internal conflict. Make sure that the trials that they go through, if you're using the hero's journey template, don't just challenge your characters physically, but also challenge their core belief or lie and forces them to make more compromises to continue believing that lie. And another thing you could do to shake up the middle of your novel is to conclude some of your subplots. If you have subplots introduced earlier in the story, there's a chance that you hate what you're writing because a part of you feels like there's a hanging thread in the story that needs to be tied up. If it's handled with care, concluding a subplot in the middle of your story could help significantly with feeling like the middle is sagging. And tip number 4, you might be overstaying your welcome. If the scene you're writing is towards the end of your story, you might hate writing it because it feels like it's causing your story to drag. There's another first draft that I finished quite a while ago. It was a fantasy novel. It was on track to being one of the first stories that I ever finished. And I had spent a lot of time with it, and I knew exactly where I wanted the story beats to go. And there was a point in my story where it was towards the end, where there was another whole, arc or act to the story that I had planned out, another 5 or 6 chapters left. But I hated writing the chapter that was kind of bridging the gap between the last one and this one. And I didn't know why. I thought I was just getting burnt out, and that was probably part of it because I'd written a lot of the story up until that point. But the main reason why I hated writing this was because the story really wanted to end. And I kept trying to force another 5 or 6 chapters when that wasn't where the story was going. It had another 2 or 3 chapters left in it. And so every time that I would sit down and I would try to force a chapter, I would try to force myself to write more of this story that was begging to end, I hated it until I sat down and I decided that I'm ending the story because it doesn't need any more. Enough has happened. There was nothing more that it needed to tell through these additional 5 or 6 chapters. The story was ready to end, and when I finally listened to it, months later, when I finally listened to that feeling that this story needed to end, I finished my first ever draft. If you're a pantser or you're an outliner, you will probably reach a point where you feel like what you planned to write doesn't need to exist. And that might not be exactly what you're feeling, it might be really hard to pinpoint it, but if you hate a scene that you're writing, even if from the beginning you knew this scene had to be in the book, it might not anymore, because planning and outlining your story is a completely different process to writing it. And especially towards the end of your story, you have written so much, you've grown as an author, and you understand your story so much better than you ever could have in the beginning when you were planning these things out. And so make sure you listen to yourself now, because outlines are just that. They're outlines. They're not hard and fast rules that you have to stick to or else your story's going to suck. You can change things as you're writing, because when you write, you learn. You learn lessons, and your story grows far beyond its original scope, and that's okay. And you have to let that happen, or your story is going to suffer. You're so mean. Tip number 3, you might be wrong about what makes this scene important. If nothing else in this list so far has helped you, then you should take a long look at your characters and your setting and your conflict and the themes of your story, and make sure that everything in this scene is consistent with everything that you've built up until now. If it feels like you absolutely need for something to happen that isn't in line with the rules that you've built up for your story so far, or a character has to do something that isn't like their character to do as you've established already, then you should reconsider those elements of your story and think if they are exactly as they currently need to be. It just might be that your character would be stronger if you reframe their personality and goals in a way that makes their choices or actions in this scene make sense. Or maybe your world would be more interesting, or your world might be more interesting if you alter the rules to make this scene make sense. This all is to say that just because something doesn't turn out how you planned, doesn't mean it doesn't work. If you have to go back and change a part of your story to make this scene make sense, then you should at least consider that as a possible direction to go. Because you hating this scene might be you trying to say that doesn't work in the story that you've written. So, either this scene's gotta go, or the rest of your story's gotta change. And tip number 2, if you hate the scene that you're writing, is you can't be afraid to start over. Don't stick with a scene that you hate writing just because you've spent hours or days or even weeks writing it. The novel that I stopped, the fantasy novel that I stopped writing, because it was overstaying its welcome. After I realized where I really wanted the story to go, I had to delete almost 2 chapters of work to start building the foundation for a better conclusion to my story. That might sound really daunting, especially if it feels like you're gonna have to delete even more than that. Or, even less. But the reality is, I wasn't writing the story anyway, whether I deleted those chapters or not. To that extent, I might as well have deleted it and given myself the room that I needed to write a better story, one that I enjoyed and I was proud of, and even if in the end I had to write twice as much as I would have if I chose not to delete anything, it made the process twice as easy and infinitely more enjoyable. Tip number 1 is you haven't developed the transition. If you're writing this scene because you need to get to another one, you should rethink the role this scene plays in your story as more than just a liminal space in your novel. If the only possible purpose for this scene truly is just to get to another scene that's more important, you put the absolute bare minimum amount of information in words as you can into the transition. If a time jump happens, only include the time that passed in any context that is necessary for the following scenes only, nothing more. If there's something interesting that you think should happen here, consider expanding the scene into something that you personally find more interesting to write. If it's an important story beat, then it should feel important to write. Otherwise, don't write it. If the scene is transitional in nature but stands on its own, and you still hate it, then it's probably just not a good scene. Think about all the scenes that you're excited to write, or remember enjoying writing, and think about everything that made them so enjoyable. The conflict is developed, characters were developed, the plot was pushed along, and interesting information was given. Give the scene a twist that makes you as the author invested in writing it and telling it. If it's transitional, that means it already has an external structural reason for existing. Now, give it an internal emotional reason for existing. That's what makes you and readers care about it. And bonus tip 0, realign yourself. Sometimes I find myself trudging through writing a chapter, and this instinct to give it up or start over can be incredibly overwhelming sometimes. I find myself thinking about how bad the writing has been up until this point, feeling like I must have rushed everything I wrote because maybe in the moment I felt like I was rushing myself. However, oftentimes all you need to do is take a second look. Look back on what you just wrote and realize it isn't as bad as you thought it was. And if it isn't as good as you want it to be, now you've actually read the words you wrote rather than working on the memory of how it felt when you were writing it. And that's way more important and helpful to you as a writer in trying to figure out why you don't like the scene that you're writing. In conclusion, writing is hard, and part of that difficulty comes from pulling through and showing up for your novel even when you really don't want to. In the end, if you hate writing a particular scene, then a reader is probably going to hate reading it. There's no rule that says that there should be one boring scene per good novel. In fact, it's the opposite. If something isn't working, the best thing you can do for it is take a step back and take a second look. But most importantly, listen to that gut feeling. If you hate it, don't write it. And thank you for watching. If this video and these tips helped you, make sure you like the video and subscribe because I will be creating more of these. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, please let me know in the comments because I would love to share everything that I have learned. Every week, I upload a vlog of my progress, working on my new novel, editing it. And if you are interested at all, if you're an author yourself and you want to join me on this journey, or even if you're not, and you just want to be there, say that you were here from the start, subscribe because you'll get a new video every week. With that being said, thank you so much for watching and keep writing.